Here are 3 investing rules you definitely need to be aware of when investing in real estate. Now, let me premise this by saying these are not rules set in stone. They're more guiding principles or metrics to help you steer through the good investments versus the bad ones. Now, first rule, the rule of 72. Now, it deals with the time value of money. For instance, how long will it take for your money to double given a certain growth rate in an investment property? An example would be if your net positive cash flow each year grows at a rate of 15%, then that money that you put in will double after 5 years. How did I get that answer? Take 72 divided by the 15% growth rate, and it'll give you approximately 5 years. Now, if I wanted to do that, double my money in 3 years, well, that would be more like 24%. And if I wanted to use a multiple of 4, it would be a different percentage altogether. So let's talk about that. What if we wanted to change up the multiple? Well, by extension of that rule of 72, we would end up with a rule of 114 if we wanted to triple our money in the same time frame of 5 years. And if we wanted to 4x our money, well, then we would use the rule of 144. So by extension, that rule of 72 will be a guideline for you to understand and manage expectations when investing money into a certain property. An example of the rule of 144 would be similar. So we would take that 5-year term, divide it into 144 to get a 29% growth rate that would be required in order to meet your timeline. Rule number 2 is the 1% rule. Now, the 1% rule, or in some cases the 2% rule, will help you determine the likelihood of a property positively cash flowing. How does it work? The gross rental income for a property should at least support 1% of that purchase price. So the 1% rule is a guiding principle. It may not work in every market. It definitely might not work in these current market conditions where borrowing costs are really high and rental prices are flattening out. So in order to counter that, I use a 2% rule. Specifically, I'm in commercial real estate, and I realize that gross rental income is not net to my pocket. It actually has to account for the operating expense. And typically that operating expense could be 50% of that gross rental income. So what I do is I double it. I use a 2% rule in order to offset the 50% that goes to the operating expense. And whatever's left over is net to me. So the same principle, 2% of that purchase price is supported by the gross rental income that is driven by that property. Hopefully that makes sense. And by extension, another rule is the 50% rule, and it has to do with the operating expense of a building. It should not exceed 50% of the gross rental income supported or driven by that property. If you do come across something that exceeds 50%, it's most likely you're in an older building or a building that needs a lot better property management, let's put it that way. We need to drive the efficiencies up and get the operating expense ratio down. So hopefully after stabilizing the property, that is to lease it all up so that you have plenty of occupancy there and you have the operating systems more efficient, your operating expense ratio to gross rental income should be closer to 40%. And in newer buildings, you can expect that to actually be below 40%. Somewhere in the high 30s is really where we're at in this market. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what the rule of 1%, 2%, and 50% is all about as a guideline to choosing the right property. And finally, we come to the third rule, the 70% rule. Now, it has to deal with what kind of price are we going to pay for a property. Most of us investors will go out there looking for something that is not executing or delivering on its full potential. As an investor, we might be looking at dysfunctional properties, properties that need help, properties that have been poorly managed, and we want to bring that up to its full potential. So what price are you willing to pay? Well, the 70% rule tells us that we should not pay more than 70% of the full after repair value. When all is said and done and you've stabilized the asset and you brought it up to its full glory, the discount you're going to pay at that price, whatever you think that appraised value will be, is 70% of that number.